Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and a good evening to wherever you are calling in today from. My name is Jamie Besson, and I am a Senior Gender Program Manager over at the International Union for Conservation of Nature. Now, I have the distinct honor to serve as your moderator for today's event, and I want to thank you so much for being here with us. We do, as I mentioned, have a very packed agenda today, so we are going to go ahead and get things moving so that we can ensure that we have as much time together as possible. Next slide, please. Now, before we get started, we also have some virtual housekeeping points that we want to share with you today. First and most importantly, please note that interpretation is available in English, Spanish, and French. You can click on the globe symbol on your bottom navigation panel at the bottom of your screen and select your preferred language there. And also, please be aware that this session is being recorded and it will be available on our website in English, Spanish, and French, and it will also be emailed to all 930 registrants for today's event. Now, microphones are also disabled to minimize connectivity distractions. However, we really encourage you to please use the Q&A function to send in your questions, your doubts, so that we can clarify and respond during the Q&A. And as this webinar would also not have been possible without the support of our RISE Grants Challenge supporters over at the United States Agency for International Development and also the Norwegian Agency for Development Cooperation, a very, very warm thank you to USAID and NORAD partners. And I also want to share a very big thank you to the IUCN team, Rwani, Laura, Jason, and Lena, who are helping all kinds of matters behind the scenes. And finally, a thank you to you, our audience, for tuning in today. Next slide, please. Now, before we continue further, we do want to take a moment and be mindful and remind you that today's event relates to gender-based violence, which can be difficult and it can be challenging. So we do urge you to take care, and we thank you again for being here. Next slide, please. Today's webinar is also organized under IUCN's Gender-Based Violence and Environment Linkages Center. And as this event falls on the last day of this year's observation of 16 days of activism against gender-based violence, this year the UN is also underscoring some new and alarming information that in 2023, every 10 minutes, a woman was intentionally killed by partner or her family members. And it reminds us that unfortunately, not all people who experience gender-based violence are survivors. And it is with this very sobering reminder that we hold today's event, which is really designed to underscore and highlight the efforts within the realm of environmental and climate finance and programming, and that we need to and must make progress to contribute to a safer and more sustainable world. Next slide, please. Now, in this event, we will share RISE Grants Challenge insights and also invite government perspectives on addressing gender-based violence in environmental and climate contexts. And again, throughout this event, please use the Q&A function to submit questions for our speakers, and we will be collecting them and asking as many as we are able to in today's Q&A segment. We hope that the emerging experiences and priorities outlined in today's event will support you, and that we will therefore take a very short one-question poll at the end of today's event to also hear feedback from you. Next slide, please. So we're going to get started by setting the scene quickly. Next slide. So the Gender-Based Violence and Environment Linkages Center and also the Resilient, Inclusive, and Sustainable, or as we call RISE, Grants Challenge both have the same origin. It all started with a question. We knew that gender-based violence is present in all spheres of life and also in all global contexts, but were there specific linkages with the environment and environmental programming? So our journey began as IUCN, together with USAID, working to better understand gender-based violence and environmental linkages over 6 years ago when we, in 2018, started this study that was commissioned by USAID. The 2-year research process, which was then published in 2020, revealed that gender-based violence is a tool and a strategy to negotiate and reinforce existing privileges and power imbalances in the access to and the control over natural resources. We also ascertained that climate change and environmental degradation caused by extractive industries and illegal activities exacerbate these dynamics. We also found that gender-based violence is used to shape and control the world of environmental work and environmental defense, as it's used to silence or discourage women from engaging in environmental activities, jobs, and leadership. Now, a survey of environmental practitioners gave us greater insight into gender-based violence within environmental programming. Specifically, that nearly 60% of the surveyed practitioners noted that they have observed gender-based violence in project implementation, and more than 70% expressed knowledge gaps on the intersection, indicating both the existence of a very serious problem and a very severe lack of knowledge or solutions on how to address it. We also recently disaggregated this data by gender and found that both women and men environment practitioners identify gender-based violence problems, which actually challenged assumptions that gendered issues that predominantly affect women and girls are typically identified by women. Instead, the data told us that this is an issue that all practitioners encounter and seek support in addressing. Next slide, please. So ultimately, our overarching finding is that addressing gender-based violence threats and risks in environmental programming is crucial to ensure our efforts towards sustainable development offer safe and dignified conditions for women and girls and all people to freely and meaningfully contribute to environmental goals and achievements. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the research led to the creation of the center as well as the RISE Grants Challenge. Now, RISE was created by USAID in 2019 as a response to IUCN's draft research findings. And IUCN took the helm running our first call in 2022. And in late 2023, NORAD joined the grant-making basket to help us scale efforts. And as you can see from the right-hand side of the screen, the demand for support from environmental practitioners is enormous. So the center is where we work globally to collate, curate, develop, and mobilize further learning on the intersection, whereas RISE is where we direct targeted financial and technical investments to support partnerships between gender-based violence practitioners with environmental programs to build learning on the ground, which will then be disseminated and shared via the center. Next slide, please. So today, the RISE Grants Challenge is now a family of 18 projects and have worked in very diverse sectors such as wildlife conservation, Indigenous women's managed forestry, fisheries, mining, and other sectors that you can see here on the slide as well. Next slide, please. Why we also really want to emphasize that RISE prioritizes locally developed, informed, and led solutions. So all of our grants require partnerships that have local community-based presence and equitable budget sharing between partners. We also conduct a very rigorous co-creation process during due diligence itself to help projects set up and also be best positioned to contribute to global learning. And we also solely focus on partnerships that address programming on gender-based violence and environmental programming interlinkages, and we do not support projects that address these topics in separate parallel activities. Next slide, please. So though IUCN's RISE Learning has only really taken place over a few short years, we've already seen that dedicated attention and financial and programming investments in this intersection can make a difference. This slide shows a few data points from several ongoing projects and 2 past RISE projects. They show that we can ensure that women and men are receiving gender-based violence response services, and we can also address safety perceptions about gender-based violence and environmental linkages. Next slide, please. And just to say briefly that these activities and results are also incredibly important for global policy. Now, there is an increasing and accelerating number of policy processes, decisions, agreements, treaties that recognize the link between the environment and gender-based violence, and they do call upon states and stakeholders alike to address these gaps. And this slide showcases just some of these many examples. Next slide, please. So earlier this year, we held another call for a RISE grants challenge proposals in 18 countries or non-area based policy focused work. We called for applications that are addressing gender-based violence in the face of the dual biodiversity and climate crises, but also included dedicated fundings and support to addressing gender-based violence in the fisheries sector. So, though we narrowed the scope from 104 eligible countries in 2023 to 18 in 2024, we still received 741 completed applications. Now, within these 741 applications, what we found is that the thematic earmark on fisheries led to a surge in applications for that sector, and it increased by 33% compared to 2023. And as you can see from this slide, that in addition to fisheries, there were also many other environment sectors and focal areas that were highlighted by applicants, which indicate urgency around agriculture. You can see here climate change, land rights, water, and other topics. So this does still indicate to us the breadth of issues are still very broad across environmental topics. Next slide, please. And each year, the RISE Grants Challenge applications give us insights into situations that correspond to our research findings. However, we do also learn new information in cases that were either previously not documented or well known, which helps us expand our knowledge base on the challenges and risks. So, for example, as I mentioned, we had a huge surge in fisheries project proposals, and we learned a lot of new information and data from different regions. And once again, just a warning for the material that you're seeing on this slide. But in essence, applicants did share with us about the sexual exploitation of younger girls and children within fisheries. And they also shared new data on the scale of sexual exploitation in some fishing communities, which, as you can see in the top of your screen, affects as many as 60% of women fisherfolk in some places. Next slide, please. Now, in the 2024 applications, we also continued to see that there was a wide range of gender-based violence types that were being addressed. Sexual exploitation was the most commonly cited gender-based violence challenge, with sex for fish that we just talked about accounting for about 55% of these 130 cases. Economic violence was the second most common, often being grouped with other types and forms of GBV in the proposals, such as the previously mentioned sexual exploitation, but also physical violence as well. Next slide, please. And here again, through the applications, we learned about additional cases and examples that add to the knowledge base on the kinds of gender-based violence that can occur in environmentally relevant sites. So what I really want to underscore here is that in every example on this page, it refers to sexual violence that took place in relation to the guarding or management of environmental workplaces and or environmentally impacted work sites. And I just wanted to juxtapose this with the findings of an IMF report that was cited by applicants, which finds correlations between GBV reduction with increased economic productivity in environment sectors, which perhaps suggests that improving safety from gender-based violence also improves environmental engagement and results as well as human rights. Next slide, please. So RISE has been helping us learn promising practices to address these kinds of links. So we'll hear from RISE leaders in just a few short moments. And before that, I want to call your attention to 2 points. First, that we continually observe that climate and conservation specialists need dedicated care, investment, and support to appropriately adapt global best practices on addressing gender-based violence, as this is something they have never done before. And they are often unaware of unintended programming challenges if they do not use or adapt best practices with tailored support. The second is that though it seems that the urgency of both the interlinkage and the lack of practitioner know-how to address them is very clear, the finance does not demonstrate taking that knowledge into action at scale. As you saw, with nearly 2,400 requests for funding and support under RISE to date, and over 650 requests under the center, demand is simply higher than available resourcing. So as we think through 16 days this year and through this event, we should consider the status of environmental investments on building and addressing these capacities ethically and carefully, and whether they align with our priorities on inclusion, participation, self-determination, safety, and also human dignity. Next slide, please. So with this, it is my pleasure to introduce to you three resilient women who are indeed champions of inclusive environments. So first, let's hear from Samantha Munagandu from Action Aid Zambia on adapting gender-based violence response for fisheries. Samantha, the floor is over to you.
Thank you so much, Jeremy, for your introductions, and to all our honorable guests and the other attendants of this event. I'm so honored to share with you our experience in developing a gender-based violence referral pathway that has transformed environmental programming. And our journey has shown that addressing GBV is not only a moral issue, but is also essential for us to achieve our environmental sustainability goals. My presentation today is going to focus on building environmental and conservation approaches to address gender-based violence and linking it to the environmental degradation. And just an overview of what we are going to focus. We're going to understand the GBV in the environmental sector. We'll also talk about dependency of communities on the environmental resources, and we'll also integrate how we have been using our GBV referral pathway to address the GBV issues, also linking it to the depletion of the fish resources and also opportunities for collaborative actions. Next slide, please. As we all know that gender-based violence occurs across all sectors, as Jamie has already presented, but in the fisheries sector, we see that it is intertwined with survival and livelihood. And women, as primary managers of natural resources, face unique vulnerabilities, especially in contexts which become fragile, just like Zambia had declared as a disaster-prone area. There is exacerbation of challenges of gender-based violence occurrences. So our RISE project here in Zambia, which is focusing in the fisheries sector in the Western province of Zambia, we developed a RISE GBV referral pathway, which empowers women to build their confidence and boost their self-esteem so they can take control of their lives and their environment. The key issue that we address in our project is the exploitative sex for fish practices, which does not only violate human rights, but also undervalue the resources and contribute to the environmental degradation. So the conversation around the survival and exploitation of women really focuses on how women are forced to exchange sex for fish due to the scarcity of the resources. So we find that men in this sector do own the means of production, and they control how much has to be produced. And they also do determine the prices, and they also determine the customers that they sell their products to. So women are equally involved, but their role is usually informal, unacknowledged, or underrepresented, especially when there's need of technical support. And so our GBV referral pathway has been developed and has supported us to emphasize that survival-centered approach is considered, as well as confidentiality and the do no harm approach as we handle the gender-based violence cases that we address in the fisheries sector. So there are so many gaps that are existing on the ground. To start with, communities that depend on the fisheries sector have to walk long distances to access the resources. There's also population growth, and there's also an increase in the environmental degradation, which has been caused by climate change. And so our GBV referral pathway provides clear steps for handling the GBV disclosures from the time the person has had an occurrence to the time it is completely resolved from the legal support systems. Then our 2 also focuses on safety and also safeguarding of the survivors with the ethical approaches, especially that the kind of gender-based violence is one which is very sensitive, and we do not want to reveal people's identities. Then when we come to the how many communities or how communities do depend on the fish resources in the Zambezi River. So where we're implementing our project is a stretch that comes from the Barose floodplains all the way to the Museotunya, which is the Victoria Falls in Zambia. And then this is part of the Zambezi River that feeds more than 25,000 artisanal fishers and over 30,000 fish traders. And then these people do not only depend on this Zambezi River as food, but also for livelihood. And there is an intricate historical importance, which is all at stake in the face of environmental degradation. And further, Western Province in Zambia is a province with the highest number of female-headed households at 41.4%, according to the ZAMSTAT in 2023. In addition to the existing gaps, which includes lack of reporting structures at all in the fishing camps, there is also safety challenges. We also do not have proper legal, actually no legal support at all, and also the migratory nature of the fishing communities. So our GBV refuel pathway 2 has been so supporting because it has recognized the gender challenges that have been mentioned above and actually addresses the gaps, as well as supporting women in reporting GBV that has been linked to environmental degradation. It's also important to remember that women contribute more than 90% of the post-harvesting activities. And actually in Zambia, one fisherman has to save more than 3 fish traders, which are women, in a day. And we can see that there is more vulnerability of women in the scarcity of the resources. Further on the dependence of the natural resources, this leads to women to face added financial and sexual costs for them to procure the fish, which actually where their lives depend on. And then we see that there is an increased exploitation, which becomes normalized due to environmental degradation in the face of scarcity of resources. And to some extent, GBV is also used as a coping mechanism. Next slide, please. So how do we link gender-based violence to environmental degradation? To start with, this has to do with the vulnerability of women. So as we all know that women do perform unpaid pair work every day. And a day cannot pass without a woman having to interact with the environment. This is literally their livelihood and their dependence. Yet their contribution is not formally recognized. And in the midst of the needs of environmental degradation and environmental challenges, we find that the needs of women are usually overshadowed by the broader issues, which are environmental degradation. The second thing is about the impact of the scarcity. Environmental degradation leads to the scarcity of resources, such as the fish, and the depletion of fish worsens the occurrences of gender-based violence. Women who are primary traders bear the brunt of reduced fish catches and increased exploitation. However, our GBV referral pathway 2 supports environmental entities. This includes environmental-related social movements, civil society organizations, community-based organizations, environmental defenders, communities, and other actors to address gender-based violence and to mitigate environmental degradation. Even if we have a number of challenges that we face, which includes inadequate responsive services, as well as limited women participation, we still have more work to do, which calls for collaborative actions for all the parties involved. To start with, we still need to support alternative livelihoods for women so that we can reduce the dependence on relying on the natural resources such as the fisheries. Then we still have to improve on the operation of the GBV referral pathways. We can still adapt it and also integrate it into other environmental sectors and also environmental policies, even as need arises according to how everything keeps changing on a daily basis. Further, we still advocate for the policies that link gender equality with environmental sustainability. And we still have responsibilities also to invest in women's empowerment and also local capacity for sustainable natural resource management. And then in conclusion, it is not a debatable issue that environmental degradation amplifies the vulnerability of marginalized groups like women to gender-based violence. Therefore, our RISE GBV referral pathway has been a game changer for us and is a very transformative tool for addressing the vulnerabilities of women. And it is all up to us to work together. We have seen how this tool has improved community participation, how it has increased how it has increased awareness of gender-based violence linkages to the environment, and we have also witnessed greater women's participation in leadership within the fishing communities. And also, we have over 200 GBV cases which has been reported in 2024, which are directly linked to the fisheries resources. These are reported to the victim support unit and the other judicial systems that serves the that saves the GB referral systems. Then finally, we have also seen how it has enhanced recognition of women's rights in conservation. And we just hope that stakeholders will keep collaborating in prioritizing gender-based violence prevention and response, recognizing that is achieving our sustainable goals. Thank you so much. I hand over to Jamie.
Thank you so much, Samantha. Indeed, it's really important to respond to survivors. And so, just as a reminder to everyone, we do see questions coming in, so keep sending them in. So, now let's hear from Shushmita Lama from the Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact on gender based violence mitigation approaches by identifying risks and adapting safety planning. Shushmita, you have 10 minutes, and over to you.
Thank you, Jamie. Hi, everyone. I'm Shushmita Lama. Indigenous greetings to you all. I'm delighted to share insights from our ongoing work of Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact and the partner organizations, Perempuan Aman in Indonesia, in Boyak in the Philippines, and IKEA. Next slide, please. So today, for today's sharing session, I'm going to share about the linkages of gender-based violence and environment in context of Indigenous women. We'll also share different experiences of gender-based intervention in context of Indigenous communities, and share the strategies and approaches to address gender-based violence in relation to environment. Next slide, please. Under RISE IUCN project, we actually are working to empower Indigenous women to be their own agent of change so that they can fight against gender-based violence in their respective climate vulnerable contexts. For this, we use approaches such as training and workshop to build their capacities, and research and advocacy to collect data, which is require for advocacy work, and then to amplify the voices, and then to negotiate with the local and national authorities, and also at the international global level. And also we provide emergency support for the safety needs of indigenous women at different environmental contexts. And we also are now working to revise our policy to reduce the risk of gender-based violence of indigenous women in our project areas. Next slide, please. Today, I'm going to share more about the gender analysis that we have conducted in Thailand and Indonesia, and we are conducting. It's being conducted in the Philippines. Regarding gender analysis, we used RISE IUCN methodologies that you can, I think I'm sure that you all are aware of. The main objective is to gather evidence and to see the relation between gender-based violence of indigenous women, environment, human rights defenders in relation with this climate change and environment conservation in Indonesia and Philippines, and also in Thailand, and also to seek to delve into the complex interrelationship among gender-based violence, environmental concerns, and the distinct challenges that are faced by indigenous women, environment, human rights defenders. So for this, in Thailand, we studied, the study was done in Northern Thailand, Chiang Mai and Chiang Rai, whereas in Indonesia, we did our study in the East Kalimantan region with Balik Pemaluan and Balik Sapagu indigenous communities, whereas in the Philippines, we did the survey in the northern part of Luzon in Bago City. Next slide, please. Regarding the findings, actually Asia, in Asia, there are more than 260 million population of indigenous people, which accounts for about a third quarter of indigenous peoples and indigenous community. Indigenous women are considered as the nurturer and steward of the land, and then their relationship with environment is very close. But indigenous women face multiple discrimination, one for being women and the for being indigenous, though their role in environment conservation is very high. But indigenous women also face exclusion and marginalization, which is a similar pattern in all the three countries. And their role, their authority, and their voices are often ignored in decision-making processes, in household and in community level. And they also have very limited access to opportunity and the resources. And in case of indigenous communities or land, there's a grabbing of indigenous territories by the state, which affect indigenous women's management areas such as water spring, community forests, and land. So because of that, indigenous women always are in the fear of losing their ancestral land and sacred sites. And also due to infrastructure and development projects like dams. So their places are they face the challenge of relocation and then control over their resources. in Indonesia, with the development of new capital city in the East Kalimantan, now there are increased concern about rising crime and insecurity, and there is a rise in the gender-based violence also. In case of Philippines, local women are facing violence and intimidation from the authority and law enforcement because the state are forcing the state are grabbing their land in the name of extractive mining of resources and hydropower. And also indigenous women do not have access to justice, and then they have to endure legal persecution. Because of that, they face different forms of violence, physical violence, psychosocial, emotional, and all sort of violence. And also there are like cases, we see the cases of different contamination of, using of the chemicals in their resources that also impact their lives. Next slide, please. When we ask our participant in the in one of the capacity building training, and when we asked about the gender-based violence, she said that gender-based violence in my community is deeply entrenched. Indigenous women are excluded from decision-making and dismissed when we speak out. In case of Indonesia, when it is moved to Kalimantan, it led to the loss of land, sacred sites, and meaningful jobs. So indigenous women and girls are left with many tasks. And environmental degradation from construction has worsened their health conditions. So despite these challenges, indigenous women are at the front fighting to protect our land, culture, and health. We persist even when our voices are ignored. Next slide, please. So for strategies to address the gender-based violence within the specific environment landscape, first, we did research. Based on the research, we now have data, both qualitative and quantitative data, and we also identify the gap between environmental programming and the gender-based violence in indigenous community. In Indonesia, our partner, Perempuan Aman, is using a tool called engendering participatory mapping. That is a mapping which use the perception of indigenous women and then where to identify the indigenous women management areas where indigenous women's knowledge and authorities are taken into consideration in the mapping process, because largely ancestral land are taken as a men domain, right? So indigenous women's collective rights and indigenous people's rights are documented. Now we have document. And then also, we also use the strategy of building their capacity through different regional and local and national level training and workshop to aware them of their rights. And also we have the consortia where we share our regional experiences, and we also provide support to the survivors of gender-based violence. Next slide, please. And till now, what we have seen is that in case of indigenous women, we have to see like indigenous women are different from other women, because indigenous women, we talk about our collective rights. Now they are aware of their rights through our local interventions, and now they are also initiating within their group to protect their customary territories and their lands. Now we have evidence in the form of research and documentation. Now women are feeling more comfortable in reporting to the authority. Now we also create awareness of the authority, due to which now they are also considering indigenous women cases more seriously. In addition, we are also doing our collective advocacy, and then more solidarity among indigenous women are formed now. Next slide, please. Oh, yes. Yeah, this is a picture of all of our indigenous women environment human rights defenders from Philippines, Indonesia, and Thailand in one of the village in Thailand when we have this regional exchange program. With this, I would like to conclude my presentation. Wish you all the Human Rights Day, women's right is human right. Let's not forget about Indigenous women's right. So thank you. If you have any question or concerns, kindly let us know. Thank you.
Thank you,
Jimmy.
Sushmita. So let's invite Joyce Peshu from the Kenya Wildlife Conservancies Association to share with us. Joyce, floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I'm Joyce from Kenya Wildlife Conservancies Association. And the focus of today's presentation will be guidelines for conservancies in Kenya. So guidelines that we develop to prevent and address gender-based violence within conservancies. Next slide, please. So we will, just to provide the context, is that the conservation space in Kenya is one of the key sectors that is yet to achieve gender equality, as well as put in place measures to prevent and mitigate gender-based violence. And as we know that women are the major users of natural resources, and because of their roles, it makes them vulnerable to either physical or sexual gender-based violence, as well as other forms of gender-based violence, and that the effects of climate change that affects a lot of the areas that conservancies are, usually women are often more vulnerable because of either their low economic, socioeconomic status, their gender roles, as well as their limited access and control of resources. Cultural norms and beliefs and practices play a huge role in terms of marginalization of these women, and sometimes it can translate to gender-based violence. And we believe that conservancies are locally led institutions that offer a promising approach to address some of these issues. Next slide, please. So as KWCA, we are a membership organization for conservancies that place communities at the center of wildlife conservation. And our work revolves around accelerating the growth of effectively managed conservancies so that it can impact local communities and wildlife. And among our approaches that I'm going to focus on is our approach to inform. And we collect, distribute information about conservancies and for conservancies to be able to positively influence decisions, policies, and practices within conservancies. Next slide, please. So within the project, the RISE project, from the support from USAID and IUCN, we are currently implementing a project that focuses on advancing equitable social gender power norms in climate vulnerable community conservancies. And it focuses on creating inclusive and equitable environment for women to be able to meaningfully participate and benefit from wildlife conservancies. And we do this within the Tsavo landscape and the Amboseli landscape, working with partners in the gender sector, that is CARE, as well as Center for Rights Education and Awareness, but also working with local partners, that is Taita Taveta Wildlife Conservancies Association and Amboseli Ecosystem Trust, and work with fauna and flora as well to support with our gender and our conservation work. Next slide, please. So looking at our focus in terms of the guidelines, and as I had mentioned that I will focus on our approach to inform, that with conservancies, you know, working mostly for the benefit of wildlife and people, the understanding that on addressing gender-based violence is a new space for conservancies, and it's something, you know, that they haven't worked towards. And so, you know, developing these guidelines are quite key so that they can be able to integrate these components within their work. And how we do it is that we develop manuals and guidelines to be able to guide conservancies managers, conservancies leaders, rangers, and landscape association staff. And then we disseminate these guides either by publishing and printing and disseminating it to these constituents, or having workshops and convenings where we take them through this content that are in these guidelines. Next slide, please. So in terms of our focus on advancing equitable social norms, we've been able to work with CARE to contextualize our tool that they've been using in the health and nutrition sector called social analysis and action, to contextualize it for community conservancies in Kenya. And this tool is focusing on addressing the harmful gender and social norms that act as a barrier to promoting gender transformative approaches or changes within the conservancy. So we've been able to contextualize this tool, and what you can see on the screen is just the title page of that manual. And apart from developing this tool, we've also convened, staff from Landscape Association, which are conservancies, conservancy support organization, to disseminate to them, to allow them to understand this essay manual. Next slide, please. So other tools that we have developed, one is the safeguarding tool, the safeguarding guide for conservancies, that is aimed at supporting conservancies to be able to understand safeguarding, put in place measures to prevent safeguarding, as well as support conservancy staff to be able to report some safeguarding measures. And it has different components in terms of preventing safeguarding concerns, looking at policies and procedures, reporting these concerns, and as well as responding to safeguarding concerns. So that's the safeguarding tool. In terms of reporting, a key focus on survivor-centered approach in terms of responding, managing, safeguarding in investigation. So that guide, the safeguarding guide, has those components, and it's for Landscape Association and conservancies. The other guides is on gender-based violence, looking at GBV risk mitigation, GBV response, and GBV risk mitigation. The other tools, like you can see on the screen, is the one for achieving gender equity in conservancies, that provide guides or provide details on how conservancies can be able to promote gender equity within conservancies. Next slide, please. So last but not least, apart from providing guides or guidelines for conservancies, we work with conservancy support organization, and these are Landscape Association like the Taita Taveta Wildlife Conservancies Association and Amboseli Ecosystem Tribe. So we support them to also develop internal institutional policies that can guide them to ensure that they put in place measures to prevent gender-based violence, especially aspect of sexual harassment within workplaces. So these policies are also key for us. And what we've been able to see is that providing these guidelines for conservation support organizations like Landscape Association and conservancies have led these conservancy managers, leaders to be more aware. And also they've been able to put in place gender considerations within their interventions, within their program, as well as GBV preventive mechanisms that comes into mind as they design their programs within their operations. So we've been able to see that these policies, institutional policies, as well as guidelines that we are supporting them with, especially from our lessons in implementing interventions to prevent GBV within the environment context, has really helped with that. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Joyce, for the fantastic presentation of all the tools that you guys have been working so hard to develop. And so, Jason, if we can move on to the next slides, that would be great. So thank you so much to Samantha, Shashmita, and Joyce for your insights. And now for this part of the event, we'd like to call on governments to share their national perspectives, emphasizing their efforts to address these challenges. So remember to keep sending your questions through Q&A. And let's get started by inviting Johanna Nordby Frunstad from the Norwegian Agency for Development Cooperation to the floor. Johanna, over to you.
Thank you so much, Jamie, and hello, everyone. My name is Johanne Fremstad, and it is really a pleasure to be able to speak here today on this very important day. Before starting, I also wanted to thank the IUCN for convening this very important discussion, and all the panelists that have spoken so far, at least, for their very important and interesting contributions. So NORAD has supported the RISE challenge since last year with a contribution specifically towards the fishery sector. And next year we will make a contribution towards climate change adaptation specifically. Today, I will talk about gender-based violence in fisheries amidst the biodiversity and climate crisis. Quite a big task. So next slide, please. Thank you. So as we may not all be ocean and fisheries specialists here, I thought I'd start by providing just a little bit of context on how climate change and biodiversity loss looks like in the ocean and also in inland waters such as lakes. So in terms of climate change, the most known impacts are, of course, temperature and sea level rise. Since the 1970s, the ocean has absorbed more than 90% of the excess heat in the climate system. And the heating of the ocean is currently happening twice as fast as it did 25 years ago. So we know that during this century, we expect the ocean to enter a new and so far unknown state, which is warmer, it's more acidic, and it has lower oxygen levels, which is all due to the absorption of CO2. So what does this mean for marine life and for fisheries especially? I mean, it has led to marine species migrating polewards, for instance, away from the equator, searching for colder waters, which leads to less available fish in these areas that are often very dependent on these fisheries. And marine life is also quite sensitive to these larger changes in their living conditions. So the growth, reproduction, survival rate of fish, for instance, is expected to decrease. And also critically, most coral reefs will die off at 1.5 degrees increase in temperature, which is where we are quickly heading at the moment. And coral reefs are very important habitats for several species. If you take a look at lakes, which have not received that much attention in the climate debate, they are actually warming faster than the atmosphere and the oceans. So this is it's a very critical ecosystem. If you look at the biodiversity loss, climate change is obviously a key driver here, but there are also other important drivers. And Samantha also mentioned some of these in Zambia, but you have the habitat destruction, where activities such as coastal development or in lakes even, unsustainable tourism and the destruction of coral reefs really reduce the marine habitats. And then you have overfishing and unsustainable harvesting of marine resources, which leads to depletion of fish stocks and other marine life. The FAO estimates that about a third of the fish stocks that they're assessing are overexploited. And this is a figure that has deteriorated in the past few years. So it's not a sector with room for much growth. You also have marine pollution, including plastic waste, oil spills, chemical runoff, and things like that, which severely impacts marine ecosystems and also the species that inhabit them. Also, if you take a look at lakes, we see that biodiversity of freshwater ecosystem is actually declining faster than any other biome on Earth, which is mostly due to the population growth around these areas, which leads to increased demand for both freshwater resources, water for agriculture, as well as the overharvesting of fisheries resources. Just to note that what's a bit different about the ocean than terrestrial ecosystem is that things change slower. So if you look at the International Climate Panel's climate scenarios, all of these say that we are looking at irreversible changes in the ocean for the centuries to come. And if you just add an extra element to this, we're also seeing a rush for ocean resources now that most land area is already in use for things such as energy and aquaculture, port development, and other sort of industrial developments. Next slide, please. So why does gender matter in fisheries? Well, it matters a lot because when people think about fisheries, they think about men, and it is perceived globally as a heavily male-dominated sector. And I mean, in some cases it is, because men are often dominating the primary production of things, meaning that they are the ones that go out fishing. Next slide, please. However, as also mentioned previously, women occupy a significant portion of the fisheries value chain. And the fisheries sector is characterized by a highly gender division of labor. The most recent State of Fisheries and Aquaculture report that the FAO produces about, I think, every second year, they show that in 2022, women account for as much as 24% of fishers and fish farmers, and up to 62% of processing workers if you look at the global figures. And when looking at small-scale fisheries activities, which is the majority of fisheries, 4 out of 10 of these people are women. So women are therefore a very important part of the sector, although they may not be the majority of the actual fishers. So next slide, please. They are, however, overrepresented in informal and unpaid work and underrepresented in governance. And they also often lack the access to resources and finance to further develop their businesses. And considering the important role that women play in the sector, as just mentioned, it really negatively impacts both the women and the sector itself when they are left out of decisions that affect their livelihoods. Next slide, please. So we now have a situation where we have diminishing fish stocks, which are further threatened by climate change and overexploitation. We have a rush for ocean and lake space by various sectors and actors. And we have a highly gendered sector where women, despite what is commonly thought, play a very important but unrecognized role. And we also know, and it has been mentioned several times today, that the degradation of natural sources and climate change often worsens gender equality and heightens the risk of gender-based violence. So how is this manifested in the fisheries sector? The most common, unfortunately, example is the sex for fish practice that Samantha covered. I think she covered it very well in her presentation, so I'm not going to go into too much detail about it. Just wanted to put up some figures that, I mean, Jamie mentioned in her introduction that up to 60% in some fishing communities in Zambia are affected by this practice, which is an incredibly high number. And there's also a study that found that 34% of men in 300 households in Kenya self-reported that they exchanged assets such as fish for sex occasionally. And this also has massive health implications in these communities. And you see that HIV rates in fishing communities are oftentimes 4 to 14 times higher than the national averages. And if you count in the fact that the fish stocks are degrading and the resources are becoming increasingly scarce, this practice is likely to worsen, all other things remaining equal. Another manifestation of this inequality or harmful practices or coping mechanisms, such as child marriages. There was a report by Save the Children that came out a few years ago that shows that 2/3 of child marriages happen in regions with higher than average climate risks. And this is also very much the case in fisheries communities. As a last example, I also wanted to highlight some labor and human rights abuses on fishing vessels. These vessels are often far from shore, and a lot of things take place there that are not seen. For instance, in Southeast Asia, men and boys are frequently trafficked onto these fishing vessels, and in addition to being forced to live under slave-like labor conditions, they are also subject to sexual harassment and assaults. Next slide, please. I'm not going to go through all these examples. I just wanted to show that not only is gender-based violence extremely harmful to the people that experience it and their communities, but as has also been mentioned earlier today, it really harms the sector and the projects and the environmental impact that could have been made. For instance, if you look at the first example from the Philippines, the majority of the women fisherfolk left the Fisheries Association due to domestic and intimate partner violence. And if you take a look at the blue box on the side of the slide, it shows that if you actually address the problem, it can have really great benefits. And in this case, it was a revenue increase for the company of about $1 million per year. Next slide, please. Yes. I wanted to show this slide because it shows that violence and harassment is very much a global issue that is not isolated to any specific part of the world, although the prevalence is higher in some places than others. For instance, in Norway, we recently had some women coming forward talking about the conditions they work under at sea, with several cases of sexual harassment in quite horrific conditions. In Norway, this led to the establishment of a women's network in the sector, which was very positive. However, it has also led to a 40% reduction of female applications to the fisheries education program, which is really a shame. Next slide, please. So what do? I think we have learned a lot today already. And I think some of the example that has been shown and what the Rice Grants Challenge is trying to do really is a great way to showcase this. But first, we need awareness of the problem and how it impacts the sector if you do not address this, because it really hinders progress. And second, we need to not just look at the problems, but also the solutions. And gender equality leads to better development outcomes. We know this. It's not new. And third, we need to share best practices with each other, because we have neither the time nor resources to not share best practices and work together on this. And here I think the IUCN and the Rice Grants Challenge plays a very important role. And this event has really shown some great pathways to solutions already. For instance, the GBV referral pathway tool presented by Samantha that is so well adapted to this particular sector in Zambia. And then we need to recognize that addressing this takes time and it won't happen without financing. And this is something that we as donors must realize. So Norway places a very high importance on gender equality, both at home and also in our development projects. So again, I'd like to thank IUCN for organizing this event and for the great job that you're all doing. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Johanna. So with that, let's please welcome Gerard Howe from the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office of the United Kingdom to share your perspectives with us. Gerard, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Jamie, and thank you for convening us today on this really important day in these 16 days. It's hugely appreciated. And let me also say thank you to Samantha and Sushmita and Joyce and colleagues for their excellent presentations so far. So look, I mean, I'll be brief, but there are really just three main messages. One is this is a hugely important area. Two is that it's great to see the practice that people are talking about emerging here. And three is there are opportunities to do more going forward. So yeah, let me start again saying thank you to colleagues for those great examples. And it's clear that in this area of thinking about the combination of gender-based violence and tackling climate change, we have to do this in a partnership-based approach. We've got to work across silos in an interdisciplinary and intersectional way in order to make some of the progress that we do. And we know the scale of the challenges, and JB, you and colleagues and Johan have set those out really, really well. But you know, where we have 1 in 3 women experiencing GBV in their lifetime, everyone in the world affected by climate change and nature loss, and 3.5 billion people, over 3.5 billion people living in areas that are highly vulnerable to climate change. That's a really difficult, toxic combination. And we know we can take action here. It's both an obligation, but there's also opportunity. And again, our colleagues have said how we can do some of this. The UK and Australia launched a report at COP29 on how to tackle this intersection of gender-based violence and climate change, or if you like, tackling gender-based violence in the context of climate change, which I think is the way I might like to think about it. And partly, you know, what that report showed is the deep interlinkages between these two areas, where in South Asia, a 1 degree rise in temperature led to a 4.5% increase in the rates of intimate partner violence. And in Ethiopia, a child marriage increased over nearly 120% in areas affected by drought and flood problems. And you can see how some of those stresses and strains exacerbate existing inequalities and exposure to violence. And so gender-based violence, I don't need to tell anyone on this call, obviously, is like, as it is to everything else, is a barrier to change, including on climate. In Cambodia and Laos, 42% of environmental defenders said that safety concerns were their greatest barrier to participating in that natural resource management. So gender-based violence acts as a brake and a constraint, as well as a real threat. And so tackling these two areas together increases the impact, both in terms of our ability to keep women safer from gender-based violence, and to create longer lasting solutions to the full gamut of climate work, from natural resource management to sustainable energy transitions to adapting to future change, and allows clearly girls and women to play their full role as scientists, as advocates, as responders, as community leaders. And that's really, really important for us going forward. And it's been great to hear today from RISE grantees about the work they're already doing to take this forward. At COP29, it was great to see you, Jamie, there, but I also heard a range of innovative work from colleagues about how we can strengthen the commitment to, within the context of climate change, to seize the opportunities and the obligations to take forward on work on gender-based violence. And we heard some fantastic organisations. And again, some of these examples are worth pausing on. In Indonesia, the Shrikanda Lestari Foundation is working to address this violence, to enable more women to participate in their work through organisation of community forums, to discuss impacts of environmental degradation, but also working through those processes to increase women's participation in decision making. And that has in turn increased awareness with communities how climate change impacts feature for women and girls, and enable survivors of gender-based violence to become national climate change campaigners. And so again, finding those ways in which addressing gender-based violence and addressing the climate crisis together has impact is really, really important. But again, Jamie, you've already said it, despite this, gender-based violence really does not feature as something that is sort of thought about as a default in thinking about climate work across that gamut. And we need to sort of change that, both in overall financing terms, but in the way that we engage local communities and women's rights organisations. And it's a real priority for the UK government to think about the intersection of this space of gender equality and women's rights with climate change across the piece. And we're really committed to putting women and girls at the heart of all of our work. So at COP29, we announced new financing for the Global Alliance for Green and Gender Action, GAGA, enabling them to extend their work, supporting grassroots women's rights organisations working across a whole spectrum of work, which is really important. We're providing £5.5 million to support women's economic empowerment and social norms change in the Middle East and North Africa, which is building the resilience of women's rights organisations to climate threats. And we really feel that women's rights organisations, supporting them to be at the heart of some of these change, at the heart of decision making, will have a whole range of broader positive impacts. And I'm really proud that through our What Works to Prevent Violence programme, which has been a leading programme for the UK government for some time now, we're supporting CEDAVIP, which is a women's rights organisation based in Uganda, to integrate gender-based violence prevention into a programme to restore vital wetland habitats. And through our phenomenal programme, which our minister launched and highlighted at COP29, we're supporting the International Water Management Institute to incorporate gender-based violence into a programme preventing and reversing environmental degradation in the Middle East and North Africa. So overall, we are completely seized of the importance of this issue. We are completely seized of our responsibility to take this issue seriously through all of our climate work and to think about the intersection, as I said, ensuring that women's rights organisations are at the centre of our work. And really seized with the opportunity and the necessity of hearing from the sorts of colleagues like Samantha and Sushmita and Joyce today about what actually does work in those contexts and supporting them. And looking forward to hearing more from everybody in Q&A about priorities and concerns, what those priorities can be going forward. And I'd like to end by thanking IUCN, ActionAid, KWCA and AIPP for the incredible work you're taking and for the opportunity to speak today on this really important day. Thanks, Jamie. Back to you.
Thank you so much. And I think those are really key messages. Effective climate action has to be inclusive. And so how do we ensure and account for safety from gender-based violence as an assurance? I think it's really also important for us to also listen to some examples of how we can recognize risks and take action. So with that, it's really my pleasure to introduce Marlene Oliva from the Ministry of Environment, Natural Resources of Guatemala to share some of her insights and experience on the topic with us. Marlene, over to you.
Greetings, everyone. Good morning. Since there is interpretation services, let's take advantage of that. And I will be speaking to you about a very important topic in my language, which I'll be able to do better. So thank you, IUCN, for the invitation. Can you hear me? So, and I don't know if you're able to see my picture. I'm not able to activate my screen. I'm not sure.
Yes, we can see and hear you, Marlene.
Oh, okay. Thank you. So I wanted to share with you that in the case of Guatemala, gender violence is a very important issue, even more so in relation to climate matters, because we have seen that climate action has increased violence. Millions of women worldwide are experiencing gender violence in their daily lives when it comes to access and control of resources. As a result of climate and climate activism, Guatemala has a very high level of feminicide, which it's a result of climate change because it is affecting our ways of lives, creating forced migration, and bringing about gender violence. We do not have data of violence based on gender in relation to natural resources. So it's very important to do so, to work on statistics, on different spaces, forests, coastal regions. And I've been paying close attention to previous participants today in that all of this is rising, and we don't have information to prove that that is the case, to know more about that, for us to have more information so that we can work better in terms of better policies. I have been working on public policy, which to me is where we should continue adding concrete actions so that we can have the results that we deserve to see happen. I would also like to highlight that when we talk about gender-based violence, we cannot set aside the cross-cutting portion of it. As women here present, it's not the same for us, like women who are here on this call, as opposed to women, indigenous women on the ground. Add to that lack of access, disabilities. So when we think about gender-based violence, we need to think of this as an intersectional problem so that our measures, policies we create, give concrete solutions to the challenges that women face on the ground too. So in terms of our plan on climate change and gender-based, Guatemala did a launching of its plan with the support of IUCN, Jamie, Jackie, Laura, and Project Agent of USAID. So we were able to create that plan for Guatemala, a plan that includes gender violence. And when we gathered women for them to talk about what mattered most to them in relation to this violence that they suffer when they go out to collect timber or wood or water, they face many challenges in doing so. So this plan helps to manage that, again, in all these different spaces, water, forest, and so forth. And we see the intersection. It's important. For example, we have schools to address violence related gaps in fisheries. I know I'm running out of time, but I wanted to add that the manual that IUCN has created when it comes to gender violence is very important. In Guatemala, we had a pilot program to build capacities on these issues, and now we'll be working on violence in water issues and a specific department or region of the country. And I would like for us to understand, or for international organizations that maybe listening to us, understand that the funding that come to these areas should have concrete actions, like in our case with a pilot project that we want to share with you all soon, to see how gender violence is in fact affecting women there. And we're not seeing this on a national level only, but also based on a recent convention, COP29. That is, I mean, you know how difficult all the negotiations were there at the very end on human rights. We were able to attain a positive decision at the very end, and including that, the how to manage this gap. And as a bloc of negotiators of Latin America, we have been working therein with the IUCN, UNDP, UN Women, and among other international organizations to work on these matters, incorporate them in our proposal for us to have our new plan. The challenge is major ahead. We cannot forget that women are key to climate actions. Thus, we need to strengthen gender violence policies so that they incorporate better measures that will bring about concrete results, solutions for the women who are suffering this violence. So I call on all public institutions, international ones, to unite strengths so that these projects have concrete actions come about, have disaggregated information on gender violence to begin with, and have concrete actions that help to minimize gender violence, and for all of us to understand that this violence causes women to not have full participation in decision-making spaces, to have their voices be heard, for them to request the solutions that they need. And this must be addressed urgently. As women unite, as organizations do the same in a common front, so that we can prevent for this wave of violence to continue growing, and on the contrary, for it to reduce. Thank you very much, Jamie, for this space that you have given us to share about this. We would like to have more time to talk about this, but it's important to continue talking, searching for more solutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Marlene. And actually, you raise a very important point, and it's something that, unfortunately, of course, Q&A is always very limited in time. And actually, if I can ask everyone, all the speakers, to open their cameras one more time, I actually wanted to ask the same question to all of you, because what I'm seeing a lot in the Q&A is a lot of questions that refer to backlash, pushback, reticence, whether it's women coming forward, or a reticence of communities to engage in this topic when it comes to drawing attention and taking action on gender-based violence in environment sectors. And Marlene, you just mentioned, the challenges ahead. And so if we could start with you, perhaps, could you give us like a 1-minute reflection on how do we overcome some of the pushback that we're seeing in global climate policy?
Well, a minute, it's complicated, but let's try. If I address it from the standpoint of international organizations, they may request as a requirement a project that does include gender-based approaches and also link it to financing, because otherwise we will be left without financing and we cannot move forward. And then include it in any action plans for climate change at the national level and local level as well. So we need to start addressing these different elements. If they are not in writing, they do not exist. If it's not included in our public policies, then we cannot enforce it. So it's important for national governments to do it at the national level, and then international organizations included in their priorities for accepting proposals, so women may have full participation and effective participation in violence topics, and then show data regarding gender-based violence.
Thank you so much, Marlene. And
Thank
actually, could I direct the next question, similar theme to Joyce? There were some questions in the Q&A also about the value of engaging men and what are some of the challenges when it comes to addressing their reluctance or their resistance.
Thank you. Yeah, so the backlash from the men, I think, begins when they are not engaged from the beginning, from the start of any interventions related to gender-based violence, related to promoting gender equity, challenging the norms. So if we come in with an approach of, just going directly to the survivors and the victims of gender-based violence, then we receive a lot of backlash. So for us, I think one key thing that we have worked on is male engagement in terms of, selecting the male leaders, influential leaders within the communities, and just making them aware of the intervention, them understanding why it is important that we want to address gender-based violence, challenge some of these norms, and put in place some of these practices. So when they understand and they become allies to the work that we do. So for us, those are the interventions. And working with, being a conservation organization, working with organizations that are gender progressive, have experience with male engagement, they bring in some of the tools that they use. That for us has really worked. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Joyce. And Shushmita, I did see that you responded to one question, but just so that everyone can hear from you, there was a question about addressing the protection of women from powerful interest groups and the pushback and the backlash that women may receive in their environmental defense.
Yes, thank you, Jimmy. Yes, especially in case of indigenous community, indigenous women face a lot of backlash, and especially from the local authority and the national authority, and then because the land are occupied or taken by the government, and then which has like profit motives, right? So in that case, what we are doing is we are documenting the cases of human rights violation in Philippines and in Indonesia also, and then we are building their capacity on legal rights, so that how they can fight against their right, the violations of violations or the backlash from the government, and also helping them providing pro bono legal services and supporting them, referring them to the legal services, and also building the community solidarity. Because if we are not together, then it's not easy to fight the government or the state authority, right? And then also planning the strategic advocacy to fight against the government, because it's not easy, right? And it's not easy in case of Philippines. There is a lot of intimidation from the state, and then also red tagging, right, that risks their life. So we have to really think strategically and how we deal this very legally, right? Yeah, that's the thing. Thank you.
Thank you, Shushmita. And Samantha, there was also a question asking about the gender-based violence disclosures and referrals that you guys have been working on. And a similar question, but this time from the other lens, in terms of reluctance, how does the project encourage, women to come forward and ensure that their safety needs, and also, unfortunately, in the case of gender-based violence response, that their needs are actually met through the project?
Thank you so much for the question. We do a number of approaches, and one of the strategic approach that we have been using in the project is to ensure that we have awareness raising in the community, and we engage the women, especially in the training sessions that we tailored.
We have a small technical issue, but hopefully Samantha will come back in just a moment.
Our engagement.
Oh, I think we might have lost Samantha. So until we can get her back and maybe restart that response, actually, Gerard, there was also a question referring to land security and land tenureship for women. So if I could pass the question to you, Gerard, how do we address, there's a lot of global regression and pushback in the gender equality spheres. So how do we ensure that we also address land security and land tenureship rights within the approaches that we're discussing today?
Yeah, thanks. I thought that Joyce's points about working with men and social norms is really important, and Sushmita's point on solidarity is really important. I think, the point of the question is to recognise that this is contested territory, and it is unsafe territory, because you're talking about redistribution of resources and assets and power ultimately, right? So the first principle has to understand risk and safety as perceived by local communities, and begin from that point, because there is real risk here for all communities, and particularly acute risk for women and girls, obviously, and then creating some moments of solidarity and looking for ways to be documenting and moving at a pace that is safe and ambitious, I think, is really important. But we have to be led by local communities in that action, Jamie, I think. Thanks.
Thank you, Jared. And actually, that brings me to the question for Johanna, which is, you talked a lot about sharing best practices, ensuring that we're learning from each other. So what does Norway hope to see from that shared learning in terms of translating learning into change within the modality of how we do environmental work? Over to you.
Thank you so much. And that is a very difficult question. But we are really hoping to see learnings coming out of this. The Rice Grants Challenge that we can incorporate into other projects that we are supporting, and that we can sort of do that from the beginning. Because if you don't do it from the beginning, then you have a less chance to succeed. So I'm hoping that we can manage to do that. And also, of course, as I mentioned, that there is a budget to do that, because it will not happen by itself. It needs financing. Thanks.
Thank you. I think that's actually really important, that we don't leave it as an afterthought, and we have to start our work addressing these things. And Samantha, I see you made it back online. So just in case you wanted to finish your thought, in case technology is with us, I can pass the last minute to you.
So I raising awareness using various means, as well as comprehensive trainings that are using our adapted manuals to address these gender issues, and as well as linking our communities to the service providers. Yeah, just to respond to the question. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Samantha. And thank you so much to all of our speakers. So before we close, we're just maybe going to be 1 or 2 minutes over time today. We just wanted to run a quick poll to ask you how useful today's session was. You'll see the poll appear in your screen just now in English, and the translations are also on the screen in Spanish. Jason, if you can share the next slide, that would be great. And the question is, after attending this webinar, whether it helps you to think about ways to start approaching and thinking about addressing gender-based violence in environmental programming. And so there's a couple of selections here about how informative or not informative you found it. And it's really useful for us to hear your feedback so that it helps us tailor future events. And while you guys are filling out that poll, I also wanted to say once again, thank you to all of our speakers and all of our partners. And thank you, the audience as well, for joining us and deciding to close this year's 16 days together with all of us here in this event. And as mentioned at the start of this event, this session was recorded and we will share it via email with all event registrants. We will have more news, we'll have more announcements, and we'll also launch, as Johanna mentioned, another call for applications in 2025. So do please subscribe with us for news and stay in touch. And as we close this event, let's ensure that beyond these 16 days, that every day is a day that we reflect and improve the ways that we consider safety and dignity from gender-based violence for all people who engage in environmental action. Every single day, not just these 16 days, is an opportunity. And it's our choice to make that progress. And it's our choice to set those budgets and set those priorities. So let's do our best to integrate that into our work. And so on behalf of IUCN and co-organizers, we wish you a wonderful rest of your day, a beautiful International Human Rights Day, and a very thoughtful close to this year's 16 days. Thank you so much.